The microphone had been his closest companion for 40 years. Frank Moonlight Sullivan, 67, sat in the second row of the Tonight Show studio, his voice-trained fingers unconsciously adjusting an imaginary headphone while his eyes searched for the red on-air light that had governed his life since 1984. Tomorrow night would mark his final show on WKRP 94.5 FM, ending 4 decades of late-night radio that had made him the unseen friend of insomniacs, night shift workers, and lonely hearts across the tri-state area. The worn station pin on his vintage band t-shirt caught the studio lights as he shifted in his seat. Frank had collected pins from every concert, every promotional event, every milestone in his radio career, but the simple WKRP, the voice in the night pin, meant more to him than all the broadcasting awards gathering dust on his apartment shelves. That pin represented 14,600 nights of being there when people needed a familiar voice in the darkness. What Frank didn't know was that his impending retirement had triggered an outpouring of letters, emails, and calls to the station from listeners whose lives he'd touched in ways he never imagined. Over the past month, people had been sharing stories about the DJ who remembered their requests, who talked them through difficult nights, who somehow always played exactly the right song at exactly the right moment. Frank had stumbled into radio almost by accident. Fresh out of college with a literature degree and no clear direction, he'd answered an ad for a weekend overnight slot at a small AM station in upstate New York. The pay was terrible, the hours were brutal, and the audience was tiny. But something about speaking into the darkness, knowing that somewhere out there people were listening, had captured his imagination completely. By 1984, he'd worked his way up to WKRP's coveted midnight to 6 shift, the graveyard slot that most DJs avoided, but Frank had made his kingdom. While other jockeys chased the lucrative drive time shows, Frank had discovered that the real magic of radio happened when the rest of the world was asleep. That's when people needed music most, when they called in with their stories, when radio became less about entertainment and more about companionship. Over 4 decades, Frank had perfected the art of intimate broadcasting. His voice, warm, conversational, never rushed, made listeners feel like they were chatting with a wise older brother. He didn't just play music, he curated emotional journeys, understanding that someone driving home from a night shift needed different songs than someone struggling with insomnia or someone working through heartbreak. He'd become the unofficial therapist for night owls across 3 states. Truck drivers called in to share road stories. Hospital workers called during break times to request songs for patients they couldn't save. College students called when homesickness hit at 3 a.m. Elderly listeners called just to hear another human voice during the long hours before dawn. The Tonight Show tickets had been a surprise gift from his producer, Janet, who'd worked with Frank for 15 years and understood that he rarely left the radio station except for emergencies. "You've spent 40 years entertaining people," she'd said. "Time to let someone entertain you." It was a Friday night taping in November, and Jimmy was in good spirits after interviewing a popular singer about her new album. During his commercial break interaction with the audience, his attention was drawn to Frank by the collection of music pins on his shirt and the way he seemed to be listening to sounds the rest of them couldn't hear. "Sir, I love all those pins. Are you in the music business?" Frank straightened up with the practiced posture of someone accustomed to being on even when off duty. "Radio, actually. I've been a DJ for 40 years. The overnight shift at WKRP 94.5. Well, I was. Tomorrow's my last show." A warm murmur went through the nearby audience members. Radio DJs, especially the old school ones, had an almost mystical quality for many people. The disembodied voices who had provided soundtrack to their lives. 40 years in radio and the overnight shift? That's incredible. You must have some amazing stories. Frank's face lit up with genuine enthusiasm. "Oh, the stories. You know, people think radio is just playing music, but the overnight shift is different. That's when people really listen, really connect. You become part of their lives in ways you never expect." "Tell us about that. What's it like being the voice people hear in the middle of the night?" "It's an honor, really. From midnight to 6 a.m., you're talking to people who can't sleep, people heading home from work, people dealing with whatever life has thrown at them. Nurses on break, truck drivers crossing the country, students pulling all-nighters, folks who just need someone to remind them they're not alone. Jimmy was immediately drawn to the depth in Frank's voice, the way he talked about his audience with such genuine care. It sounds like you've been more than just a DJ. Well, you know, when someone calls at 3 a.m. to request a song for their father who's in the hospital, or a trucker wants to dedicate something to his family back home, you realize you're holding something precious. People trust you with their stories, their feelings. That's not something you take lightly. The sincerity in Frank's voice was unmistakable. This wasn't someone who had simply played records for 40 years. This was someone who had served as a lifeline for people navigating the loneliest hours of the night. Jimmy made a decision that would transform the evening. Frank, I have a feeling there are some incredible stories behind those 40 years. Would you mind sharing some of them with us? Frank looked uncertain. Well, most of what happens in radio stays between you and the listeners. People call in with pretty personal stuff sometimes. I understand, but maybe you could share some of the ways you've connected with people over the years. As Frank made his way to the stage, the applause began. Warm recognition for someone who had spent decades providing comfort to people in their most vulnerable hours. When he reached the stage, Jimmy helped him up and guided him to a comfortable chair. Ladies and gentlemen, Jimmy announced to the studio, this is Frank Moonlight Sullivan. For 40 years, he's been the voice in the darkness for overnight radio listeners across the tri-state area. Frank, tell us what it's really been like. Frank settled into the chair, and suddenly he was in his element. Storytelling was, after all, what he'd done best for 4 decades. You know, the overnight shift gets the calls that other shows don't. I remember New Year's Eve, 1995. A woman called in crying because she was spending her first New Year's alone after her husband passed away. She didn't want to hear party music. She wanted something that would help her remember their 50 years together. So we spent an hour playing their song, their wedding waltz, music from every decade of their marriage. By the end, she was laughing, sharing stories about their life together. Frank's voice grew stronger as he continued. Then there are the regulars, like Tommy, the night janitor at the hospital, called every Thursday for 12 years to request jazz for the patients who couldn't sleep. Or Maria, the overnight nurse who'd called during her break to ask for something soothing for the pediatric ward. You start to feel like you know these people, like their family. What about the more difficult calls? Frank's expression grew more thoughtful. Those are the important ones. People call when they're scared, when they're grieving, when they're making tough decisions at 3 a.m. I had a teenager call once, really upset about some problems at home. We talked for 20 minutes about music, about finding things that make you feel less alone. She called back a year later to tell me she'd started college and wanted to thank me for that night. The audience was completely engaged, drawn into Frank's gentle storytelling about the intersection of music and human emotion. Jimmy reached into his jacket and pulled out his business card. Frank, I want you to have this first. Not because I want anything from you, but because 40 years of being there for people deserves recognition. But Jimmy had prepared more surprises. Frank, we reached out to WKRP and some of your listeners before tonight. We wanted to hear their stories about you. What do you mean? Jimmy pulled out a tablet. Listen to this. From Sarah Chen, an emergency room doctor, Frank's voice got me through medical school. During those brutal overnight study sessions, he was the constant that kept me grounded. He'd play exactly the right music to keep me focused. And when I'd call in feeling overwhelmed, he'd remind me that someone out there believed in me. I'm a doctor today partly because Frank Sullivan believed I could do it. Frank's eyes filled with tears. Sarah, she used to call from the medical library. Such a dedicated student. Jimmy continued reading. From Robert Martinez, a long-haul trucker. Frank was my co-pilot for 15 years of night driving. He understood the loneliness of the road, the need for human connection at 4 a.m. when you're crossing Kansas and questioning all your life choices. His voice made those highways feel less empty, made the distance between me and my family feel shorter. Oh my, Frank whispered, overwhelmed by hearing how his work had touched people so deeply. There's more. From the overnight staff at St. Mary's Hospital, Frank dedicates songs to our patients every week, for families keeping vigil, for patients who can't sleep, For staff members dealing with loss, he's been the unofficial chaplain of the overnight world, providing comfort through music when words aren't enough. The studio was completely silent, captivated by these testimonials to Frank's compassion. Jimmy stood and addressed the audience directly. This man has spent 40 years proving that radio isn't just about playing music, it's about human connection. He's been the voice that reminded people they're not alone during the darkest hours. He turned back to Frank. Your listeners wanted to do something special for your retirement. They've created the Moonlight Frank Community Fund, donations to help night shift workers, insomniacs, and anyone who needs support during difficult overnight hours. Frank gasped, bringing his hand to his mouth. A fund? To help night shift workers? Yes, but there's more. WKRP is dedicating their overnight studio to you. It's going to be called the Frank Sullivan Memorial Booth, and every overnight DJ who follows will know the standard of caring you set. Jimmy had one final surprise. And Frank, because you've spent 40 years playing the perfect song for other people, we wanted to give you a chance to play one more. From backstage, a technician wheeled out a vintage radio console, complete with turntables and a professional microphone. Frank, Jimmy said, this is a live connection to radio stations across the country. They're all standing by to simulcast whatever you'd like to say and play. One final message from Moonlight Frank to everyone who's listening in the darkness. Frank was openly crying now, overwhelmed by the recognition and the chance to say goodbye properly to his invisible family of listeners. He approached the console with reverence, adjusting the microphone with practiced ease. Good evening, night owls, Frank said, and instantly his voice took on the warm, intimate quality that had comforted millions. This is Moonlight Frank, coming to you one last time from, well, not my usual studio, but the spirit's the same. For 40 years, you've let me into your cars, your homes, your hearts during the quiet hours. You've shared your joys and sorrows, your hopes and fears, your stories and songs. And tonight, I want to share something with you. He carefully placed a record on the turntable, The Way You Look Tonight by Frank Sinatra. This song is for everyone who's ever felt alone at 3 a.m., for every night shift worker keeping the world running while others sleep, for every person who's found comfort in a voice in the darkness. Thank you for 40 years of letting me be your friend. The music doesn't end here. It just finds new voices. Keep listening. Keep connecting. Keep believing that somewhere out there, someone cares. As the music began to play, Frank stepped back from the microphone, and the entire studio rose in spontaneous applause. Ladies and gentlemen, Jimmy announced, Moonlight Frank, 40 years of being the voice in the darkness, proving that the most important conversations happen when the rest of the world is asleep. The episode that aired became one of the most shared Tonight Show segments of the year, with radio stations across the country playing tribute shows to honor Frank's legacy. Frank's final show the next night was listened to by over 1 million people, the largest overnight radio audience in the station's history. The Moonlight Frank Community Fund raised enough money to support night shift workers facing emergencies for years to come. Frank spent his retirement volunteering at senior centers and teaching broadcasting to young people. Discovering that leaving radio didn't mean leaving his calling. It meant expanding his voice to help others find theirs. At 69, Frank still wakes up at midnight out of habit, still believes in the power of the perfect song at the perfect moment, and still carries a small microphone pin. A reminder that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply be there when someone needs to know they're not alone. Because sometimes the most powerful performances happen not on stage, but in the intimate space between a voice and an ear, where music becomes medicine and a DJ becomes a friend to everyone who's ever needed someone to talk them through the darkness until dawn.